So what narcissism is about getting power, attention, esteem, status. You know, you fell in love with the good-looking surgeon. There's a reason you fell in love with him. You like the good-looking surgeon part. You don't like the fact that he's self-centered and callous and unfaithful and manipulative and gaslights you. There's always trade-offs there.
If we think of the public figures who had this period of success and fame and then had kind of a falling from grace when they were discovered.
Just in general, someone in that position or Madoff, here's what you do. Epstein was like, I only take clients with $1 billion. Like, dude, you don't even have a college degree. So you focus on the looks, the appearance, the Steve Jobs turtleneck, and then you affiliate with a lot of high status people. And then the question is what happens when the truth starts breaking into your plot? And with narcissism, you can just lie. You're not going to say, oh yeah, you caught me. You're going to fight it all the way to the end, and then you're going to blame somebody. It's very natural in any environment where there's a lot of money and, you know, like anything in the startup world or in the investment world. Actually, we do that now in science, unfortunately. Any place where you can make stuff up, you're going to find narcissism because people want fame and attention.
Welcome to the Language of Evidence. This is the podcast where we dig deep into areas of interest to the broad public, but through the perspective of experts, bringing new insights and painting the big picture and putting things in context. And today I am thrilled to have Professor Keith Campbell with us, a world-leading psychologist and an expert in narcissism. And I just finished reading his book, The New Science of Narcissism. It's an incredible book. I've not read it. I highly recommend it. How I got interested in this topic is by thinking about public figures who have had a period of fame and were celebrated for a certain achievement, and then were later sort of discovered that the achievement was based on either fraud or misrepresentations, and they had sort of a falling from grace experience. And there are several examples like Bernie Madoff, Elizabeth Holmes, Lance Armstrong. I remember when I was training in oncology, Lance Armstrong came and visited the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and the floor where patients with testicular cancer were being treated. And at the time, this was such an inspiration. He was such an admired figure. And it was such a moment, such an inspiring moment. And then a few years later, he was, his doping was discovered, and not just doping, but his elaborate scheme to conceal it from authorities. So, and then of course, Andrew Wakefield has been in the news, and he recently recorded a video where he sort of reflected that now he's been vindicated because Donald Trump said something about separating the MMR vaccine into the individual components. And Andrew Wakefield said, see, I was right all along, as though a tweet from Donald Trump somehow is evidence that he was correct. So all of this got me thinking about why does this happen? And I could not think of a better person to have a conversation around these topics than Professor Campbell. He earned his PhD in psychology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is a professor at the University of Georgia. His major area of expertise is narcissism and related aspects, self-esteem, personality, cultural trends. He's published hundreds of peer-reviewed papers, and I mentioned his latest book, and he's spoken publicly, has been interviewed broadly in the media, and really has advanced this field. So, Professor Campbell, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the introduction.
I would love to start by asking you how you came to this field, your interest in psychology broadly and in narcissism. And I did come across one interesting fact that actually it seemed like it was Donald Trump that inspired you, partially.
I have been inspired by him. I mean, my dissertation, for sure. Yeah, that is the case. So I'm a social personality psychologist. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a psychoanalyst. I did a master's degree in clinical psych, so have a little experience, but I'm not trained or licensed to do any clinical work. So again, my perspective on this is different than a lot of people in the more clinical psychiatric perspective. I've been interested in the self and how the self is structured and how we can transcend the self. And I was very interested in some of these more Buddhist or Vedic concepts of the non-self and non-duality back in undergrad and grad school. And it was very hard to study that. So I found myself studying self-enhancement, or how people inflate their egos. And there are many ways we do this. And this is a normal thing that we all, to some degree or another, engage in. And to sort of better understand that, I started looking at the personality variable of narcissism. And nobody was really studying, very few people were studying it back then. Fred Rodwell, John Moore, for a couple really good academics, a few other people. And I liked it because it was a Freudian term, and I'm sort of a Freudian at heart, a little more of a Jungian, but I always loved the old psychoanalytic ideas. And so I started studying narcissism, and it just sort of turned, it's like, it's like the guy studying COVID right now. But when I started studying narcissism and they had school shootings, like what the heck? And then, as I said, for my dissertation, I was looking at narcissism and relationships because I was a relationship researcher, and started looking at trophies partners, how you get self-esteem by marrying somebody attractive. That's where the Donald Trump came in, because he was sort of notorious back in the day for having trophy wives. He's actually stuck with Melania since my dissertation, so I might have got him on the last one. And then we had social media happen. So we had, the internet happened, and social media happened, then selfies happened, and the whole culture started changing. I happened to be a postdoc with a woman named Jean Twenge, who's a great academic and generations researcher. So we did a lot of work together. And so it kind of took off from there. It was basically a way of understanding ego, either in close relationships or in leadership or in aggression or in the social media space. I kind of just pushed it in all sorts of different spaces.
And I'm just struck by the decades of experience, and that you've studied narcissism for 30 years, if I understand that, right?
Yeah, it's probably been 35 years at this point. Yeah. I'm getting old. Yeah, it's probably incredible. Too much. The book you were holding was my effort to put everything onto a book so that somebody could grab it, read it, and then start reading the actual scientific literature and not have to spend 30 years getting up to speed.
Yes, no, it's certainly, it was eye-opening for me and answered a lot of my questions. And perhaps for folks who have not thought a lot about narcissism, would you explain at a high level the various key features and the flavors of it?
Yeah, it gets tricky, and it's one of these words. Like when I started study narcissism, no one even knew what it was. They couldn't really pronounce it. And then it became so popular, everyone was using it as a term, but no one really knew what it meant. And so they were using it as a description of their ex-boyfriend or the politician they didn't like. And it kind of turned into mean jerk. But that isn't really what narcissism is. And it gets complicated. Narcissism is basically the personality trait or style that has to do with maintaining and inflating the ego or the self. So narcissism is about getting power, attention, esteem, status, admiration, basically a strategy for increasing your ego. That's what makes narcissism. It's about self-love, and it comes from the myth of Narcissus, who fell in love with himself. So that's kind of the core of it. I'm better than you. I'm more important than you. I'm kind of a big deal. So then where it gets complicated a little bit is it turns out that there's a couple different flavors of narcissism out there that people have looked at historically for at least, I'd say 100 years. They've looked at these two forms. What most of us are familiar with from our ex-boyfriend, the terrible surgeon we had, the politician we hated, is that you combine this sort of self-importance and maybe antagonism and maybe lack of empathy But you combine that with self-confidence, charisma, energy level, the pursuit of social status, maybe social attractiveness, or maybe physical attractiveness, because people who are narcissistic spend more time on their looks. And what you end up with is what we call grandiose narcissism, which is this form of narcissism that contains something that's pretty negative, which is I'm self-centered and think I'm better than you and have a sense of entitlement, but has something that's kind of positive. I'm energized. I want to be a leader. I'm charismatic. And so people that are more grandiose narcissists are often attractive when we meet them. They make good political leaders. We like them as any sort of leader for a while. We like them because we like the extroversion part and the more antagonism stuff that we don't see till later. So that's the more grandiose form. I'm probably getting way in the weeds here. I apologize.
No, this is perfect.
Okay, good. Then here's where it gets confusing. Normal people in the world are running into grandiose narcissism all the time. People in the clinical psychology world or the psychiatry world are running into a little different flavor of narcissism. They're seeing people that have the same, I'm important, I have a sense of entitlement, I'm a big deal, but at the same time, I'm also a little insecure, I'm defensive, I have low self-esteem, I'm easily shook and rattled by people's criticism. And this became known as vulnerable narcissism because these are individuals who are narcissistic, but they're easily overwhelmed by external forces. My president, Donald Trump, if I went up to him and said, "You're a jackass, President Trump," he wouldn't care. He wouldn't be rattled at all. And if he did care, he'd just pick me up and kick me. He just wouldn't care. But because he's not that vulnerable, he's a little vulnerable. I mean, he's got some of it, but not so much. But if I find somebody who's a vulnerable narcissist, I'm like, you're a loser, they're going to break. And then they're going to go and they're going to fantasize about revenge. They're going to say, God, he said this mean thing to me. I'm going to show him who's the best. I'm going to get back at him one day. And they're going to stew. So it's a much more internalized. So sometimes this more vulnerable form is called covert narcissism because it's a little harder to see. It looks more like anxiety or depression. And so historically what happened is the clinicians were seeing more vulnerable narcissism because they were coming in for, because of their depression, because no one thought they were a big deal. The grandiose narcissists were only coming to the clinicians when their spouses dragged them in for being unfaithful, cocaine addicts or something. So they were being dragged into therapy because their spouses or families couldn't deal with them, but they weren't in there so much. And then some clever clinicians about 50 years ago thought, well, maybe the people that seem really grandiose on the outside, underneath it are really vulnerable. And they started this model of narcissism that really these narcissistic people you run into are really deeply insecure and don't like themselves and hate themselves. We don't really see that. It's not really what we find. What we seem to find is that there are these two general forms that seem very different. They report different childhoods, they have different personality structures. Some people have both of those forms together. Some are grandiose with some vulnerability. They can be prickly. So that's the two basic forms of narcissism. Then what happens is there's a clinical form of narcissism, which is the personality disorder. So if you take a personality trait like narcissism, I'm a big deal, everyone look at me, I'm a little manipulative, I'm willing to exploit people, I'm cheating on my wife. You make that extreme, so I'm really a big deal and I'm cheating on my wife a lot. And then you make it inflexible, so it's hard for me to turn off my narcissism. And then it starts messing with my life, causing what they call clinically significant impairment. So my narcissism is ruining my marriage. My narcissism is ruining my work. I can't take criticism from my boss. I'm making risky decisions at the bank I work at, losing money. I'm not learning because I think I know too much. Then a psychiatrist can say, my goodness, Keith, your narcissism is so elevated, we're going to diagnose you with a personality disorder called narcissistic personality disorder. And that is relatively rare. At one time, we thought it was more like 7-8%, but it's more really at any time more like 1 or 2% of the population that can be diagnosed clinically with NPD. So there's sort of the trait, the personality trait, And then at the very extreme, it can become a disorder, similar to the way your buddy who drinks too much might not be an alcoholic. They might just drink a little too much. That's kind of a problem. Or you have a buddy who's, I'm real anxious, but I might not have an anxiety disorder that needs to be treated. It could be like that. So you can have narcissism that is not clinical, or it can be clinical or psychiatric. That was a very long answer.
No, this is perfect, and this is so important, not just for theoretical reasons. This has big practical implications, I think, for all of us. And I was very interested to read kind of your reflections that the narcissism is not necessarily a bad thing, and in fact, you have a whole chapter on living with narcissism and taking advantage of one's narcissism, or living with someone who is a narcissist.
I will say this. I want to get this out there. People who are narcissistic can be, the most awful, horrific people you've ever met. So I don't want to narcissism's a good thing. But as a scientist, when I look at reality, I'm like, most things are trade-offs. Most personality traits are trade-offs. And it's easy for someone to say, look at that narcissist, he's a loser. And you go, that's not helping me. All you're doing is being moralistic. You don't understand the narcissism is benefiting him in some ways and hurting him in some ways. And the narcissism might be benefiting you in some ways and hurting you in some ways. You fell in love with the good-looking surgeon. There's a reason you fell in love with him. You like the good-looking surgeon part. You don't like the fact that he's self-centered and callous and unfaithful and manipulative and gaslights you. Does that make sense? So there's always trade-offs there. And if you think that narcissism is only negative and you fall in love with somebody who's narcissistic, or you vote for somebody narcissistic, what does that say about you? It says you're foolish. But what I'm saying is no, you're not foolish. These things are complicated, and you made a mistake because you fell in love with one part of a person and you didn't see another part, or you voted for one part of a person and you didn't see another part.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. So there are many sort of practical kind of directions and avenues here, but one, since we started talking about Trump and some of the public figures, there's this really interesting question of whether people in the psychiatry field are allowed to diagnose public figures. And you've commented on this, going back to the Goldwater rule. And I was curious when you said that you don't see the sort of the impairment in Donald Trump.
So there's a couple issues there. The first is that psychiatrists in the US, and this doesn't apply to me because I'm not a clinician at all. I can say anything I want. But psychiatrists aren't supposed to make diagnoses at a distance. And it goes back to when Barry Goldwater was running for president, and they made a bunch of statements about him that turned out to probably not have been accurate at the time. And when Trump was running, you had a bunch of people diagnosing him as having a personality disorder, which, they could be right. I am not a clinician. I mean, it's a question of impairment. And that's a clinical question. If you're a professional psychiatrist, you're not supposed to be looking at somebody on television and giving them a clinical diagnosis without having more information or more data. I understand that. I'm not really judgy about it. If one of my friends who's a psychologist or psychiatrist wants to diagnose somebody, I'm like, fine. It's okay. It's just an opinion. My take on the diagnosis of Donald Trump was, I would say, you got a guy who's a billionaire who lives in a tower with his name on it in New York City. He was one of the most famous television celebrities, successful celebrities, one of our most successful real estate developers. His family, his kids sort of seem to like him. I mean, they might just be hanging around for money, but they seem to sort of like him. And he got elected president a couple times. I'm like, he's full of himself, but is he clinical? I'm like, he had a pretty good run for somebody with a psychiatric diagnosis. That's all I'm saying. Now, here's what someone would say to disagree with me. They'd say, Keith, I see your point, but imagine if he had more control over his ego and his ego wasn't running him around like it does. Wouldn't he be even more effective? And that is possible. It's possible that if, be able to work with Trump and say, dude, you're doing this stupid stuff because of your ego, and it's causing you to lose respect, and it's causing you to perform poorly. Maybe he would perform better. I don't know. So that's the counter argument to the argument I'm making. If people want to continue, you could say, yeah, if you dial that narcissism down, his performance would go way up. I would argue the only reason the guy's the president is because he's got an ego that big. And if he was a happy, well-adjusted guy, he would have cashed out with his, first $100 million and bought a little place in Florida and went, fishing. So it gets really complicated, especially when you talk about these world leader types, because the ego it takes to want to lead an empire. I mean, read the history of people who lead empires, and they're not shrinking violets. They have egos. In the old days, they would have people get together and say they were a god. I was just talking about Alexander the Great yesterday, and that's just the nature of people who run empires. They have a high level of confidence. I mean, Xi, Putin.
Yes, absolutely. So if we continue with that theme of public figures and kind of going back to my curiosity, if we think of the public figures who had this period of success and fame and then had kind of a falling from grace when they were discovered that they were hiding something.
Yeah.
And had this big secret, like in the case of Elizabeth Holmes, building a $1 billion company claiming to do a bunch of blood test from a little drop of blood. And then it turned out that didn't work, never worked.
Yeah, that's remarkable, isn't it? It's it's the big lie. It's the brazen lies can work like that because people just can't believe it.
And reflecting on what's required for someone to do this, right?
Yeah. So I would say a couple things. Well, what someone like that would do, I don't want to talk about her in specific like I'm an expert, I'm not, but just in general, someone in that position or Madoff or anything. Here's what you do. I act confident, successful, important. Like, Epstein was like, I only take clients with $1 billion. Like, dude, you don't even have a college degree. But so you focus on the looks, the appearance, Elizabeth Theranos, I think, would do it. She wore the Steve Jobs turtleneck. She dropped her voice to register. You do a lot of stuff to look good. And then you affiliate with a lot of high status people that people trust. So you surround yourself with people that other people trust. So you get photos with them, you get clients with them. This is what Madoff would do. If you look at Theranos' board, you look at the people on the board, you go, oh, those are pretty impressive people. And if they all think she's legit, she must be legit. So that's kind of one of your things you do in manipulation, is you get people together. And then the question is what happens when the truth starts breaking into your plot, and how do you defend against that? And with narcissism, you can just lie, you can belittle or destroy the person attacking you, which is pretty common. They just get destroyed for attacking you. You can come up with a more and more brazen lie, which I think people do quite often until they get caught. And then once they get caught, they're going to blame somebody else and try to get out of it. And then they'll rehab themselves, coming up with another scheme and going for it. And it might even work. So you're not going to say, oh, yeah, you caught me. You're going to fight it all the way to the end, and then you're going to blame somebody else for it. You're not going to take responsibility for anything. I don't know what happened. And I think in some of these cases, people start off just like, I'm going to just run a scam. I think in many, though, however, people start off with something they think is legitimate. Their ego is too big. They're like, I'm going to pull this off. I can imagine her thinking, yeah, I can read cancer from a blood drop. I heard this from a scientist. I got a big enough ego. It's going to work, and I'm going to will it into existence. And if it had worked, we would be talking about her as one of the greatest medical entrepreneurs in American history. You know what I mean? You kind of have this belief in something, and if you can will it into existence through this phenomenal self-confidence, then people call you a great entrepreneur in America. And then sometimes you can't do it, and it just becomes a giant scam because you can't unwind the mess you made.
Uh-huh.
I think all this is complicated, and I do think it's very natural in any environment where there's a lot of money and, like anything in the startup world or in the investment world where you can kind of, modern art, you can do the same thing. You can kind of make stuff look better than it is. Any world like that, you're going to get narcissism. Humanities where you can make stuff up. Actually, we do that now in science, unfortunately. There's a lot of scientific fraud around narcissism. Any place where you can make stuff up, you're going to find narcissism because people want fame and attention.
You have this really interesting table when narcissism helps and when narcissism hurts. And things like narcissism helps in initial meetings with people, public performance, short-term romantic relationships, charismatic leadership, as opposed to when it hurts is in long-term relationships, ethical performance, ethical leadership. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that holds up. For example, if you look at the research at leadership, there's two big things people are interested. One is leadership emergence, which is who becomes a leader. And the second is leadership effectiveness, who's a good leader. And then within effectiveness, you can look at sort of ethics versus performance, sort of an ethical leader or the performance leader. With narcissism, what you see is you're very good at becoming a leader. We see it in presidential elections. We see it in family businesses. We see it all over the place because narcissists want to be leaders. They have the energy to do it and that charisma and drive. This is the grandiosity piece. So narcissists are likely to become leaders. And when they get to be leaders, they want to win. And if that means crushing other people, that's not such a big deal for them because part of narcissism is that relative lack of empathy. So if you look at great United States presidents, when they're measured for greatness based on different greatness ratings, that correlates with presidential narcissism. Probably our most narcissistic president was Lyndon B. Johnson, who got us into Vietnam. I mean, he messed this country up to no end. The stuff he did was horrific. There was one episode where the reporters were saying, "Why are we in Vietnam?" And he just pulled his pants down. I won't go into it more. I mean, people don't understand how bad some of this stuff is. He was an incredibly effective leader. He got a lot of stuff done. He stole a lot of stuff too, got rich, That's just the nature of that narcissistic leadership. Somebody like Jimmy Carter, and I'm in the state of Georgia, so he's one of our native sons. Jimmy Carter was a one-term president. No one thinks of him as a great leader. Kind of embarrassed as president, but everyone respects him as a great ex-president. So if you ask Americans, who's your greatest ex-president, probably Jimmy Carter. Because of his low narcissism, though, he wasn't a great leader. Just kind of was weak. So it's complicated.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. So we're talking about narcissism, and you're an authority on narcissism. But if we step back for a second and we think about this scenario of this, that we've talked about, the public figure who has a secret and then falls from grace. First of all, what is this phenomenon even called? I was struggling to find any literature on this or a convenient name for this phenomenon.
Yeah, I would say this falls probably broadly under the concept of fraud. Maybe. At least if you talk to the accounting profession, they would call this accounting fraud, maybe embezzlement, maybe other things people are doing, but it probably falls down to fraud. A lot of it's commingling assets. You get money in from investors, you put it into your own account and things. And the personality profile most associated with fraud would be something like psychopathy or maybe antisocial personality or something where I just really don't care about people. Narcissism isn't necessarily about fraud. It's about being looked at as popular, high status, and important. The reason they go together is people who are narcissistic want to have power and money and fame and people around them. If they're a great cello player or a great piano player or a great football player, they can do that. They don't need to do fraud. Or if they're just super good looking, they can just be really attractive. They don't need to do fraud. The reason you see narcissism doing fraud is they can get away with it because of the charm and the charisma and the looks, and people like them a little more than somebody's a psychopath. So they can bring it in. But I don't think fraud for a narcissist is like, I'm not doing it for fun. I don't get a rush from it. It's like I'm doing it because I'm just primarily focused in ego, and this is the best way for me to get my ego needs met, assuming I don't really care that much about other people. Narcissism and psychopathy are like cousins, they kind of travel together. But I usually think when somebody's really in it for the ego, it's more narcissism. When they're in it for something else, money, power, manipulation, that would be more psychopathy. And they often travel together. So somebody like Jeffrey Epstein, who I never met, but just sort of looking at his personality profile, you see a lot of narcissism there, a lot of physical appearance, the status seeking, the fame, the fantasies, the whole thing is narcissistic, but it's also very psychopathic. It's manipulative. It's dishonest. It seems like it was maybe dishonest from the start within reason. So it seems like it has a couple of those things going on, and there could be more to it as well. I don't know.
Is impulsivity a component of the psychopathic trait that I thought for this kind of long-term fraud that is well hidden, that maybe impulsivity is not such a good thing?
Yeah. So impulsivity is more linked with psychopathy than narcissism. There's some debate about this in the literature, but usually when we look at grandiose narcissism, usually you get a little bit of conscientiousness. With psychopathy, and especially something like antisocial personality disorder, it's much more impulsive. But what we like to do on television is we have lots of psychopathic characters with very high self-control. So Hannibal Lecter, the murderous psychiatrist, he's a psychopath, but very high self-control. He's able to do his crimes for a long period of time. But in general, if you go to a prison and you start talking to the inmates, you're seeing a lot of people who are impulsive. And people with high self-control are more likely to be narcissistic. And they can have a really long career if they have enough self-control to not get caught doing bad things. I mean, they can make their whole life and kind of die alone, hated, but they can make it all the way to the end because that self-control is really important.
Interesting. You talk about several triangles.
Yeah.
Different triangles. So there's this dark triangle.
Yeah.
Is that still kind of accepted in the field?
Yeah, it's so the idea was Del Paulus, who's a personality social psychologist he's at British Columbia. He had this idea, the first paper was 2002, saying, look, narcissism and psychopathy and another trait we call Machiavellianism, which is this very high level of manipulativeness and deceitfulness. He goes, all those traits seem to hang together. They're not the same. They're a little different, but they seem to share a core. And so he called it the dark triad. And the core they shared was what we would call antagonism or low agreeableness or maybe self-centeredness. But you have, sort of antagonism plus, hey, look at me, attention seeking, that's narcissism, and antagonism. And hey, I'm looking out for number one and I'm going to do whatever I want right now. Hedonism, the more impulsivity, that would be psychopathy. And I really want to manipulate and control people, but I can do it behind the scenes. I can be the little finger behind the scenes running the show. I don't need the fame. That's more Machiavellianism. And so you have these three different traits. And then later they're like, well, what about sadism? That's kind of being mean for the sake of being mean. And they added that, made it a dark tetrad. Conceptually, what's going on is there are a lot of traits that share a core of antagonism or interpersonal callousness or low agreeableness, but you blend it with other ingredients, almost like a recipe, and you end up with these different personality styles. And so it's very commonly used. But it's not, like I say, it's not written in the stars. It's not an archetype. It's not a gene. There's not a gene for the dark triad. It's more just a way of organizing these personality profiles. And what's interesting there is like at least three of those are named for people. Like Machiavellianism is named after Machiavelli. And all he did was write a book for the leaders. He wasn't the guy. He just kind of helped the leaders lead. And Narcissus, who, was in the Greek myth, the Roman myth, and Marquis de Sade, who we named sadism after. So there is no person named psychopath. That just means soul sickness. So that's the dark triad. And then Josh Miller and I made a vulnerable dark triad because we were like, well, we'll make a triad with vulnerable narcissism. And then you had more borderline personality configuration and sort of this secondary psychopathy. And then Scott Barry Kaufman, who's more of a humanist, he said, well, what if we had a light triad? And he made one with, Kantianism and humanism. And I I always forget the third in that. And I think I had an energized one. I'm like, what if we just centered it on extroversion and had, grandiose narcissism and hypomania? And so we're just playing with personality structure doing things like this. But that dark triad was really useful for people. It just got very popular. They liked it. It's a way people conceptualize it.
And you mentioned the energized triad. Actually, I thought that was really interesting. And you mentioned that, was it a graduate student, Lane Sedor?
That was Lane, yeah. Yeah, that was Lane was interested in hypomania.
Because when I looked at that description, and it's grandiose narcissism, hypomania, and boldness. And you say entrepreneurs may say their new idea will revolutionize the world, be a game changer, or at least make them rich. Even if it rarely works out, they convince themselves that their project or idea will have a widespread effect. Yeah. That is, and you mentioned the business world. I'm sure this is so common in the business world. The fake it till you make it kind of concept. But in the book, you say that there's not much research on this energized triad. Is that still kind of?
Yeah, because I just made it up. And I don't, what happens is I sort of make something up, and then like 10 years later, I'll go see if anybody ran with it. I don't know. I don't know if anybody will. I do like that idea. Boldness is a sort of a sub component of psychopathy. So some models of psychopathy have sort of this trait boldness. The example I think of is my examples are all like 50, 60 years old. I apologize to your audience. I think of the test pilot, Chuck Yeager, who back in the day was bold, assertive, supremely confident, didn't become an astronaut, I think because he was too hardcore, but not self-centered and, hardworking. You can't fake it as a test pilot. You die the second you start faking it. So legit, but bold, fearless. Sometimes they talk about fearless dominance when they talk about psychopathy. So it's really like pure extroversion, pure assertiveness, pure drive. And it's that extroversion piece that drives a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So for our listeners, there are obviously a lot of practical implications for someone who can see features of narcissism in themselves or in the partner, etc. Is there some red flags that one should look out for? Like you mentioned, the certain even way of dressing, the certain way of associating yourself with these huge,
Yeah. So narcissism's a tricky thing to see in other people. And, people go, it should be easy, but it's often not. And the reason it's not easy to see is when we start relationships with people and this is talking from the U.S. and I know the world is different, but the U.S. for pretty extroverted society culturally. And so I start a relationship with somebody who comes up, hey, got a smile. They shake my hand. They seem confident. They seem like they got a job. They listen to me. I'm like, I like this person. Now, if I'm dating, I'm married 25 years, I'm not dating, but if I'm dating, I meet a woman, she's real confident, it seems like that. I'm like, I like this person. I'd like to date this person. And what happens is we start a relationship, we start working together, we become friends. And then once we get going in our relationship, usually it starts going, now we start becoming like, we got to depend on each other. We got to care about each other. Maybe I've got something bad happen at work and I need a shoulder to lean on. Hey man, I got to talk to you about this thing happened at work. And it turns out this person's not interested in that at all. They're not interested in closeness. They're really just interested in you to the extent that you can make them look or feel better. And then what happens is they go, hey, I thought you were my best friend. They're like, well, I found another friend who's better looking than you, has higher status, and I don't need you as a friend anymore. And you're like, wait, I thought we were friends. And you're like, well, we were friends, but you're not useful to me as a friend anymore because I can get more status from this other person. Is what happens with relationships. Is that, hey, I found a new wife. She's younger and better looking, but we've been married for 10 years. We've gone through all this together. We know each other. We support each other. We have this deep relationship. Yeah, but I'm not getting my ego needs met. And I don't care about you all that much. Care a little bit, but just not that much. So I think it's very hard to see narcissism immediately. What you will see when you meet somebody narcissistic is you will see a path or a trail that they've left behind them of damaged people or damaged relationships. So if they're hurting people, they will have done, they're not going to tell you this. They'll lie about it and blame everybody else, but you will see a past of that. The other thing I sometimes suggest is look at how people treat others that are maybe below them on the social totem pole, maybe people they're envious of above, maybe they're bad-mouthing people. But generally, if you're dealing with somebody narcissistic, they want you to like them. Feels good to them for you to like them. So they're going to be maybe charming to you. Sometimes in the relational literature, they talk about love bombing if it gets really extreme, but they might be really nice to you, but you might watch them belittle the staff at the restaurant or, mock other people for their failings or shortcomings. Guys, a little narcissism there, a little ego there. But again, it's hard to see because of the way relationships are structured. And with grandiose narcissism and all that extroversion and self-confidence and, like I said, physical attractiveness, these are all attractive features. So when a woman calls me, she's like, I'm such an idiot. I fell in love with this guy. He's a narcissist. I'm like, why are you an idiot? He's a good-looking guy. He told you he was a CEO. He dresses well. He has a Porsche. I'd fall in love with the guy. I don't blame you. Problem was, maybe if you'd slowed things down and got to know him first, you would have. So usually the advice is if you're jumping in a relationship with somebody, if you slow it down, it gives you more chance to see the narcissism. Slow it down, look at people's experiences and their history with other people, and that'll help you get a better read on somebody than just the initial interaction.
Yeah. No, that is so helpful. As you say, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior.
Yeah, that's the classic. I mean, that's what psychologists have said forever. There's no magic. People just are consistent over time. That's why we have personality, the whole field. So you assume you're going to see consistency. The challenge with somebody narcissistic is they're not going to say, oh yeah, I was in this relationship and then really broke this person's heart. And then I did it again. I'm probably going to do it to you too. They don't say that. You have to kind of figure that out yourself.
And of course, you add the important caveat that people do change.
Yeah. So one of the things you hear in the narcissism, kind of the broader discussion, is that people who are narcissistic can't change. And when I look at all the research data, the answer is, people can change. People can change. Here's the problem. If I think I'm better than everybody else, I am good looking and super successful, I'm not going to want to change. It's going to be very hard to motivate me to change. And two, you're not going to be able to change me. So what happens is people go, my husband, I keep using the man as example, it could be the wife, but I say, my husband's narcissistic. Yeah. Can he change? Yeah. Great. Can I change him? No, you can't change him. I could give you the name of a $500 an hour psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist probably couldn't change him if he didn't want to change. So there's a huge problem with motivation in changing narcissism. It's not that it's impossible to change, it's that there's just a motivational problem. I look at it like an addiction. If you have a friend who's an alcohol addict, or maybe they're into, amphetamines or something, and they go, do you want to change? I want to change, but not that much. It makes me feel good. So it's very hard to change things like that. People do change, but it's hard. With narcissism, I think my ratio is probably 100-to-1 of calls from people who are like, I'm dealing with a narcissist who's a nightmare and destroying my life and my family, versus I'm a narcissist and want to be a better person. And when the narcissist calls and says, I want to be a better person, it's usually because people, you get to a certain point in your life and you go, all the little ego stuff, you look around, you go, well, that guy's got a family and his family loves him. And I respect that. And that guy's got a family. You're a narcissist. You don't get that. You don't get a family. You don't get a loving family. And so you go, how can I be the best if I don't even have a loving family? And so you start to go, well, maybe there's something going on I need to change. And so that's when I've seen people wake up. They go, there's something I'm missing that a lot of people have. I have things that look good on paper. I got a six pack, and I got, I've got a good job. At least it sounds good, but I don't have what some other people have. So sometimes that narcissistic desire for love might be a way to, you go, hey, you got to sacrifice something for that. It can't be all about you. You got to give a little. So that's when I see people want to change, but it's very rare.
Interesting. Well, thank you. This was, for me, just so eye-opening, this conversation and the book. Is there anything in the last few minutes, is there anything else that you think we didn't cover or would be important for people to know?
No, I appreciate you. Appreciate you reading the book and actually talking about this stuff. As I said, I always try to think of things as a trade-off. So if you're listening to this going, Keith is pro-narcissism, it's like, no, I see both sides of these things. And I try to meet everybody where they are. Yeah, that's what I would offer.
Maybe just one quick question about the future. And you talk about the future, genetics research, maybe. What else do you envision? Where is this field going?
So it's so interesting. A few years ago, I thought we would get far with genetics and get to the point where we could maybe get 30-40% of the genetics or something. And it doesn't look like we're getting there with personality. It looks like we're getting maybe max 15%. And I'm probably overestimating that. And this is a little kind of a wonky conversation about looking at, heredity and family versus looking at actual molecular genetics, the molecules. So I think we have a long way off with that, with genetics. I think the neuroimaging, we have a long way off on that. I was pretty excited about that. I think the world has turned into a little bigger mystery than I thought it would have been 5 years ago. And so that's good because I like mystery. But I don't have an easy answer for change. I'd also like it if there was a gold standard clinical treatment for narcissism that somebody had developed, and there really isn't still. I mean, despite all the interest, there has been no federal interest in funding research like this that I've known of or been part of. So without a huge amount of money from National Institute of Health or something to do a big clinical trial, we're not going to know a lot of the clinical answers.
Yeah. And I think there was just something in the news this morning about defunding some of the mental health research and NIH. So it's kind of going in the wrong.
Yeah, and I'll tell you a story. I got one grant funded 20 years ago that was in the fundable score, and I got a call from NIH, and they said, "Yeah, you're refundable, but narcissism isn't a major mental health problem." And that was the end of it. I'm not joking. I mean, they just didn't consider it. They were interested in schizophrenia because people don't see the problem with narcissism is that it affects everybody else. They think it's like, well, the narcissists seem pretty happy. It's like, yeah, they just destroy everybody around them. That's the problem.
Was this before social media?
It was right at the very early stages of social media.
Because now, and of course, maybe we couldn't do a part 2 if you're open to it and talk about the social, because there's just so much. And I will refer the listeners to your book and your discussion of how all of this impacts the social media and amplifies narcissism. So that's a huge area. If we can perhaps in the future be better prepared and be better educated consumers of social media.
I tell you, social media runs on fame, anger, funny cat videos, and the fame piece is narcissism. Like ego runs a lot of it. Just the nature of it. If they paid people for something else or they ran a different algorithm, it's attention seeking.
Yes, absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Hey, I appreciate it. Thank you for doing your homework.
Of course. Thank you. And hope to see you again.
Awesome. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.